My mom abandoned me when I was 7, and now her husband is after my inheritance. Hey everyone, I'm Mike. Before we get into it, do me a favor and hit that like button. Trust me, this story is wild and you don't want to miss any of it. So let's rewind to when I was around 6. Back then, life seemed pretty good. I lived in a big house with my mom. My dad passed away when I was just a baby, so it was just the two of us. He left me a large inheritance, but being so young, I didn't really grasp what that meant. I only knew that my mom always seemed to have money, and we lived comfortably. One day, out of nowhere, my mom sat me down and said, "Mike, sweetie, I have to go on a business trip. It's really important, okay? You're going to stay with Uncle Rick for a little while." At that age, I didn't think much about it. Uncle Rick was the fun uncle, the one who let me watch movies I probably shouldn't and bought me candy when my mom said no. So in my mind, I thought, awesome, this is going to be fun. She hugged me goodbye, and I waved her off, thinking it would just be a few days, maybe a week. I had no idea it would be a long time before I saw her again. Uncle Rick picked me up, and the first few days were great. We ate pizza, stayed up late watching movies, and he even let me play his old video games. It felt like a mini vacation, and I wasn't worried about anything. But then things started to change. Days turned into weeks. I asked Uncle Rick when my mom was coming back, and he would just shrug it off, saying, "Soon, kiddo." Soon, but he had this tired look, like even he wasn't sure anymore. Weeks became months, and I started to feel it. I'd see other kids at school being picked up by their parents while I waited for Uncle Rick, wondering why my mom wasn't there. One day I asked him again, "When's Mom coming back?" That's when he snapped. It was the first time I saw him angry. "Your mom's not coming back, kid," he said gruffly. "She left you with me, so stop asking." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but it hurt a lot. Life with Uncle Rick went from fun to a nightmare. He started getting irritated with me over everything. If I left toys out, he'd yell. If I asked for help with homework, he'd sigh, like I was a huge burden. He'd say things like, "I didn't sign up to babysit some kid and your mom just dumped you on me." I began hiding in my room more, just to stay out of his way. My room became my safe haven. I had a small radio that I listened to while drawing pictures for hours. It was the only thing that kept my mind off everything else. Sometimes I'd try to convince myself that my mom was just running late, that any day she'd walk through the door and say, "Surprise, I'm back." But as the weeks became months, that hope started to fade. There's one night that stands out. I had this stuffed bear my mom gave me. It was old and worn, with one eye missing. I hugged it close, crying quietly, hoping Uncle Rick wouldn't hear. I didn't want him to call me a crybaby or tell me to toughen up, but I felt so alone. It was like my whole life had fallen apart, and I couldn't make sense of it. It seemed strange to think a 6-year-old could feel that way, but I did. Things just kept getting worse. Uncle Rick's annoyance turned into outright cruelty. He'd make comments about how I was eating too much or how I was costing him money. I didn't understand how money worked, but I got the point. I was a burden. I started eating less, even when I was hungry, and kept my room spotless, hoping to avoid his anger. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. He'd still get mad, slam doors, and sometimes just disappear for hours, leaving me alone in that big, quiet house. I'd sit there, wondering where my mom was and if she even thought about me anymore. One day I found an old family photo album in the closet. It had pictures of me as a baby, my mom smiling and holding me, even some photos of my dad. Flipping through it, I hoped for some clue, some hint as to why she left, but all I saw were smiles and happy moments. None of it made sense. How could someone walk away from that? Eventually I stopped asking about her. I figured if she cared, she'd be back by now, but she wasn't. So I decided I had to look out for myself because no one else would. I threw myself into schoolwork. It was the one thing I could control. If I couldn't manage what was happening at home, I could at least manage my grades. I became the quiet kid at school, keeping my head down and doing my work. Teachers noticed and said I was gifted, that I had potential. But I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to survive. Still, no matter how hard I tried to focus, I'd sometimes see other kids playing with their parents, and it would hit me all over again. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I good enough? I never found the answers, but those questions haunted me for years. Looking back now, I get why I buried myself in school. It was the one thing I could control. I thought if I aced my classes, if I could prove how smart I was, maybe my mom would come back and be proud of me. Maybe she'd realize what she missed. But as time passed, that hope faded, and before long I was just getting through each day, one at a time, trying to figure out how to survive on my own. By the time I was 14, I was used to keeping my head down, focusing on school and avoiding any trouble at home. School had become my escape. It was the one place where I felt like I had some control, and the teachers actually seemed to like me. I mostly kept to myself and didn't really make close friends. It was easier that way, no one asking too many questions. But then, the inevitable group project came up. Teachers love giving us those, as if they don't realize how tough it is to be stuck with random people. Anyway, I got paired with Lisa. She was one of those people who always seemed to have everything figured out, constantly smiling and always surrounded by friends. We hadn't spoken much before, but now we were partners, and I couldn't help but think, great, she's going to think I'm such a weirdo. The first time we met up to work on the project, I was super awkward and quiet, but Lisa didn't seem to mind. She chatted away like we'd been friends for years. After a while, I started to loosen up and we actually got along pretty well. Turns out she was laid back and didn't have the stuck-up attitude I was expecting. Then, one day, she asked if I wanted to come over to her place to work on the project. I hesitated because going to someone else's house always felt strange to me. I didn't want anyone to see how different my life was compared to theirs. But Lisa was persistent, and something about her made me want to say yes, so I agreed. Walking into her house felt like stepping into another world. Her family was the complete opposite of what I was used to. Her mom greeted me with a big smile, acting like I was part of the family. "Hey Mike, are you hungry?" "I made snacks," she said so casually, like it was nothing. But to me it meant everything. I couldn't even remember the last time anyone asked if I was hungry, let alone made something for me. And her dad, he was something else. He actually sat down and asked me about school and my interests. "So Mike, what do you like to do when you're not busy with school?" he asked, genuinely interested. It caught me off guard because no one had ever really asked me that before. I mumbled some shy answers, feeling a bit out of place, but they made me feel welcome, like I wasn't just an outsider intruding on their lives. Even Lisa's little brother came over, showing me his video game collection and insisting that we play together. It was such a simple thing, but it meant the world to me. I realized that I had been missing out on all these little moments that other kids probably took for granted. Sitting there, eating homemade cookies and playing video games, it felt like what I imagined a real family would be like. After that, Lisa and I started hanging out more, even outside of the project. She'd invite me over, and her family always treated me the same, like I was welcome there. Her mom would say, "Mike, you're part of the family now. You don't need an invite, just come over anytime." I'd smile and nod, but inside it gave me a warm feeling, like someone truly cared. Still, I tried not to get too attached. It wasn't my family, after all, it was Lisa's. A part of me was afraid that if I allowed myself to enjoy it too much, it would all disappear, just like everything else in my life had. But Lisa wouldn't let me distance myself. She'd always say, "Hey, you're coming over after school, right?" And I couldn't say no. She became my best friend, and her house became my escape when things with Uncle Rick got too hard to handle. There was this one day when everything felt different. I had a rough night before Uncle Rick had yelled at me because I accidentally left a light on, and he said things like, "You're nothing but trouble. Why couldn't your mom take you with her?" It hit me hard, and I went to school feeling down. I must have looked awful because Lisa pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I tried to brush it off, saying I was just tired, but she wasn't buying it. "Mike, you know you can talk to me, right? Whatever's going on, I'm here for you," she said. The way she said it, I knew she meant it. So, for the first time, I opened up a little. I didn't spill everything, but I told her enough about how my mom left and how Uncle Rick wasn't exactly thrilled about having to take care of me. Lisa listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Your mom's missing out. You're a great person, and if she can't see that, then that's her loss." It was such a simple thing, but it felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. No one had ever said something like that to me before. From then on, Lisa's house felt like a second home. Her parents would always ask how my day was, and her mom made dinners that were better than anything I ever had at Uncle Rick's. It was like stepping into another universe every time I walked through their door. I felt safe there, like I could finally relax and just be a kid for a little while. But of course, the more time I spent there, the more I noticed just how different my life was. It was hard not to compare. I saw how Lisa's family interacted, how they joked with each other, how her parents actually listened and supported her, and I realized how much I had missed out on. I kept thinking, why couldn't my mom be like this? Why did she have to leave? But I kept those thoughts to myself. The last thing I wanted was to seem jealous or ungrateful when they were being so kind to me. I knew I couldn't stay at Lisa's forever, though. Every time I left her house, it was like returning to reality. I'd walk home dreading whatever mood Uncle Rick would be in. Sometimes he wasn't even there, he'd be out late, doing who knows what. And when he was home, it felt like walking on eggshells, trying not to set him off. I started spending more and more time at Lisa's house. Her parents didn't seem to mind, in fact. They encouraged it. "Mike, you don't need to ask. Just come by any time," her dad would say with a reassuring smile. I wanted to believe them, but part of me kept waiting for the day they'd get tired of having me around. I mean, why would they want to deal with someone else's kid when they had their own family? But that day never came. In fact, they went out of their way to make me feel included. One weekend, they even took me on a family picnic. Lisa's mom packed a huge basket of food, and we all went to the park. It was one of those perfect days where everything just felt right. For a few hours, I forgot about everything happening at home. I laughed, played soccer with Lisa's little brother, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged. That sense of belonging was something I hadn't experienced in so long, and I started craving it. Lisa's family showed me what life could be like when you have people who genuinely care about you. It gave me a tiny spark of hope maybe things could get better. But I knew better than to hold on to that hope too tightly. Life had already shown me how quickly things could change, and that's where things stood. I had this second family that I truly appreciated, but deep down I still felt like I didn't completely belong. I was thankful, but there was always this voice in my head reminding me not to get too comfortable. After all, good things never seemed to last long in my life. By the time I was 17, almost done with high school, I was still spending most of my time at Lisa's place. I had gotten used to my routine: school, Lisa's, then home, and repeat. But out of nowhere, Uncle Rick hit me with some news that stopped me cold. I remember it vividly. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my room doing homework when I heard him yelling from the living room. "Mike, get out here," he shouted. I froze for a moment, not sure what to expect, because when he called me like that, it usually wasn't good news. I reluctantly made my way to the living room, trying to keep calm. When I walked in, there he was, standing by the door with his usual annoyed expression. "Your mother's back," he said flatly, like he was just announcing the weather. My heart nearly stopped. My mom? After all these years? It didn't seem real. I just stood there, waiting for him to say he was joking, but he didn't. "She's outside," he added, sounding irritated. "Go talk to her." I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to run out and hug her, ask where she had been, but another part of me was angry. How could she just show up like nothing happened after all this time? My hands were trembling as I walked out, and when I saw her, it was like looking at a stranger. She looked different, which made sense after almost 10 years, but it was still unsettling. She had this guy with her, Jack, his name was. He had this overly cheerful grin that seemed too forced. I remember thinking, who is this guy? "Mike, sweetie," my mom said, her voice shaky, like we were in some emotional reunion scene from a movie. "I've missed you so much." She pulled me into this awkward hug, and I just stood there stiffly. I couldn't bring myself to hug her back. How was I supposed to pretend everything was fine, like she hadn't disappeared for nearly a decade? After she let go, she introduced me to Jack. "This is my husband," she said, like it should mean something to me. Jack extended his hand for a handshake, and I shook it, but I remained wary. His overly friendly smile didn't sit right with me. "Hey there, bud. We've heard so much about you," Jack said, sounding far too chipper. My mom started talking about how she had to work through some personal issues, and that's why she'd been gone for so long. I just nodded, feeling detached. Personal issues was supposed to explain everything? That was her excuse. It didn't add up, but I wasn't going to cause a scene, so I nodded some more and told her it was nice to see her, even though inside I felt a storm brewing: anger, confusion, and hurt all mixed together. After a few uncomfortable moments, they asked if they could come inside. I stepped aside and let them in. Uncle Rick was nowhere to be found, which was typical. He probably didn't want to deal with the drama, and I couldn't really blame him for that. We all sat down in the living room, and my mom started talking about how she wanted to make things right, how she regretted everything, and how she wanted us to be a family again. Jack chimed in, nodding and saying, "We're here for you, Mike. We're a family now." The whole thing felt rehearsed, like they had practiced this speech before coming over. I kept my responses short, playing along, but my mind was racing. Why now? Why come back after all these years? And who was this Jack guy, really? I wasn't a little kid anymore. I wasn't going to get emotional or start crying. I had learned to keep my guard up. After that day, they started showing up more often. My mom would come by with homemade meals, spaghetti, casseroles, you name it. Jack tried to bond with me, offering to teach me how to do manly things like building stuff. I played along because it was easier than arguing, but every time they left, I'd sit in my room, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what was really going on. The only person I could really talk to about it was Lisa. When I told her my mom was back, she looked surprised but not exactly thrilled. "Are you sure this is a good thing?" she asked. I shrugged. "I don't know. She's my mom." Lisa sighed, clearly unconvinced. "I just don't want to see you get hurt again," she said. I appreciated her concern, but I didn't know what to think. I wanted to believe my mom. I wanted to believe she was trying to make things right. But deep down, there was a part of me that didn't trust it. Maybe it was everything I'd been through? Or maybe it was the fact that she'd been gone so long. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One day, my mom showed up with a gift, a fancy watch. "I know I missed so many of your birthdays, so I wanted to give you something special," she said, her eyes misty. I looked at the watch, shiny and expensive, and I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was touched, like maybe she really was trying to make up for lost time. But another part of me felt uneasy accepting it. Lisa's words echoed in my head. She had warned me about them, showering me with gifts, and now it was happening. I wanted to believe my mom had changed, but the way she and Jack were acting just felt off. Why were they trying so hard to make everything seem perfect all of a sudden? One evening, while Lisa and I were hanging out, she brought it up again. "Mike, I know you want to believe they've changed, but doesn't this all seem a bit too sudden?" she asked. I got defensive, as I always did when something bothered me that I didn't want to admit. "They're just trying to make up for lost time, Lisa." "What's wrong with that?" she sighed, giving me a serious look. "I don't trust Jack," she said. "The way he talks, the way he acts, I just get a bad vibe." I rolled my eyes, trying to brush it off. "You're imagining things. They're just trying to be a family," I said, but her words stuck with me. After that, I started paying more attention. Little things started to stand out. Jack always seemed to steer conversations toward money. He'd say things like, "So, Mike, you've got a bright future. Any plans for college?" But the way he said it felt more like he was fishing for information than making casual conversation. And my mom, she would get fidgety anytime I brought up my dad's inheritance. It was clear she didn't want to talk about it, which only made me more suspicious. Still, I kept playing along, pretending that everything was fine. I needed some time to process everything. I had a feeling something wasn't right, but I didn't have solid evidence yet, and I wasn't about to make assumptions. I wasn't a child anymore. I had learned to be cautious. Deep down, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't trust them, not yet, and that gut instinct was about to take me somewhere I never expected. So I continued with my usual routine: school, hanging out with Lisa, and steering clear of Uncle Rick's mood swings. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but now, whenever my mom and Jack came around, I paid extra attention to every detail. I noticed how Jack always found a way to steer the conversation toward money, almost as if he was trying to gauge how much I knew. My mom would just nod along quietly whenever he did. It was becoming clear that their motives weren't just about reconnecting. Then, one night, everything shifted. I was in the kitchen, grabbing a snack, when I overheard them talking in the living room. I was about to walk in, but something about their hushed voices stopped me. They weren't laughing or chatting like they usually did. They were whispering, and it didn't sound friendly. I stayed hidden and listened closely. Jack's voice was low, but I could hear the frustration. "We need to get that money, Kelly. You said it'd be easy." My heart started racing. "Money? What money?" My mom sounded stressed as she responded, "I'm trying, but Mike's not as clueless as you think. We can't just ask him for it outright." It felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. So that was it: the visits, the gifts, the whole reunion. It was all about my dad's inheritance. I leaned against the wall, feeling a mixture of anger and betrayal. I had suspected something, but hearing them talk about it like that, like I was just a pawn in their plan, hit me harder than I expected. They weren't back because they cared about me. They wanted what was mine. I quietly went back to my room, my mind racing. I felt foolish, like I should have seen it sooner. Lisa had warned me, but I didn't want to believe her. I was too desperate for a family again, so I ignored the signs. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made up my mind. If they thought I was just some naive kid who'd hand over my inheritance, they were in for a rude awakening. The next day at school, I couldn't focus. Their conversation kept playing in my head. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. At lunch, I found Lisa and told her everything I overheard. Her eyes widened as I spoke. "Mike, I knew something was off, but this is worse than I thought," she said. Without hesitation, she added, "We need to find proof. If they're really after your money, we have to be sure." I nodded, feeling thankful that she was always there for me. Together, we came up with a plan. Every time I was around my mom and Jack, I'd try to record our conversations. If I could catch them saying something incriminating, I'd have something to use if they tried anything. That weekend, my mom and Jack invited me out for lunch, saying they wanted to spend some quality time together. Normally, I would have said no, but this time I saw an opportunity. I hid my phone in my pocket with the recorder on, making sure it was positioned to catch everything. We sat at the restaurant, and they put on their usual act, smiling, asking about school, pretending to care about my life. Then Jack shifted the conversation toward college. "So Mike, have you thought about what you'll do after high school? College is expensive, but I bet you're all set with your dad's inheritance, right?" I shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "I haven't really thought much about it," I lied. Jack leaned in, lowering his voice like he was sharing some big secret. "Well, your mom and I have been thinking. We know it's a lot to handle on your own, and we just want to make sure you're making the right choices." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. He was pretending to be concerned, but I could see through it now. "We could help you manage it, just temporarily. Make sure it's invested wisely so you wouldn't have to worry about anything." I almost laughed at how obvious he was, but I kept a straight face. "I'll think about it," I said, playing dumb. Inside, I was seething. It was all crystal clear now. Everything they were doing was just to get their hands on my money. Later, I showed the recording to Lisa. "See? They're trying to take it," I said, my voice shaking with anger. She nodded, her expression serious. "We need more. One recording might not be enough. If they deny it, you'll need them to admit what they're really after." From that moment, I started watching their every move. The next time they came over, I acted like I was finally warming up to them. I let them talk about family, how they wanted to make things right. It was tough to fake it, especially when all I felt was rage, but I knew I had to play the long game. Jack seemed to buy it. He got more comfortable talking about how they'd had some tough times and bad investments, how they were struggling. I pretended to feel bad for them, nodding along like I was considering helping. Then, finally, Jack made his move. "Mike, we've done everything we can, but we're still in a bind. If you could just sign over a small portion of the inheritance, it would help us get back on our feet. We'd pay you back as soon as possible." That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I made sure my recorder picked up every word. "I'll think about it," I said, acting hesitant. My mom chimed in, "Mike, we just want what's best for you. We're a family. Families help each other." Hearing her say that almost made me lose it, but I held it in. If anything, it made me more determined to expose the truth. After they left, I listened to the recording with Lisa. She nodded, satisfied. "This is it. They're trying to manipulate you into giving up your money." We spent hours going over everything I had recorded, making sure we had a solid case. It was hard to come to terms with the fact that my own mother, the person who was supposed to care about me, was using me, but I knew I couldn't let them win. I had worked too hard to get where I was, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me. That night, for the first time in a while, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was like I finally had control over the situation. I knew what I needed to do, and this time I was going to make sure they didn't get away with it. No more pretending I was ready to fight back. After all the sneaking around and gathering evidence, I finally had what I needed. My mom and Jack had been plotting to steal my inheritance, and it was time to confront them. But I knew I couldn't just rush in, yelling about what I knew. I had to be smart, making sure they couldn't wriggle their way out. The first person I turned to was Lisa. She had been my anchor through all of this, and I trusted her more than anyone. We sat down together and went through all the evidence I had, recordings, notes, everything. "We need a plan," she said seriously. "You can't just show them what you've got. They might twist it, or worse, destroy the proof." She was right. If they caught on too soon, they could ruin everything. So we devised a plan to catch them in the act. I had to make them believe I was willing to hand over the money. I know it sounded risky, but it was the only way to get them to openly admit their intentions. That evening, I called my mom. "Hey, I've been thinking about what you and Jack mentioned," I said, trying to sound unsure. "Maybe we could meet and talk more about it." I could almost hear the relief in her voice over the phone. "Oh, Mike, that's wonderful. Let's meet tomorrow for dinner, okay? We can go over everything perfect." That's exactly what I needed, an opportunity to get them both in one place. I made sure everything was ready, and even asked Lisa to wait nearby at the restaurant, just in case things went south. She agreed, reassuring me, "We've got this, Mike. Don't worry." The next evening, I arrived at the restaurant with my phone ready, the recorder hidden in my pocket like before. My mom and Jack were already seated, all smiles, as if they hadn't spent months trying to deceive me. "Hey, bud," Jack said, with that fake friendly grin of his. I forced a smile and sat down, trying to seem relaxed. We went through the usual small talk, how school was, my plans for after graduation. I played along, but whenever Jack brought up money, I nodded, pretending I was really considering it. "I know you've both been trying to help," I said, feigning hesitation, "and I appreciate it. Maybe you're right. I could use some guidance." Jack's eyes lit up, like he'd just hit the jackpot. "We're just looking out for you, Mike. We want to make sure you're taken care of," he said. My mom was nodding fervently, as if her life depended on it. "We're family, and family supports each other," she added, trying to sound sincere. I let them keep talking, and soon enough, Jack suggested I transfer part of the inheritance into an account he'd set up for my benefit. My heart was racing, but I kept my expression neutral. "Okay, I'm open to that," I replied, "but I want to make sure everything's done legally. I was thinking we could meet with a lawyer to ensure it's all above board." Jack's face twitched for a moment, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. He quickly masked it with a smile. "Of course, we want everything to be done properly," he said, though my mom looked visibly nervous. I pushed further. "Actually, I have a lawyer friend who could come by right now. Is that okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. The truth was, I had already set everything up. Lisa's dad, who was a lawyer, had agreed to help me. I needed witnesses, people who could back me up if things went wrong. Jack's smile faltered, and my mom's eyes widened. "Mike, honey, there's no need for that," she said, her voice shaky. "We trust each other, don't we?" That's when I knew they were panicking. They hadn't expected me to bring in a lawyer. "Yeah, but I just want to be sure everything's clear," I responded lightly. "It's a big decision, right?" I could see the sweat forming on their faces. Jack opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Lisa's dad walked in, looking all business. "Hello, I'm Mr. Collins, Mike's legal representative," he said, sitting down next to me. "I understand there's been some discussion about transferring assets." The tension was palpable. Jack tried to play it off, saying, "Oh, we were just talking about a few ideas, nothing serious," but I wasn't going to let them backtrack. "Actually, Jack, you mentioned earlier that you needed the money to help with some debts, right?" I said, throwing him a hard look. Jack's expression darkened. He looked like he wanted to strangle me right there. But with Mr. Collins sitting next to me, he had no choice but to keep the act going. "Well, yes, just some temporary help," he muttered, clearly irritated. "Is that so?" Mr. Collins raised an eyebrow. "Because if you're asking Mike to transfer part of his inheritance, it has to be properly documented. Otherwise, it could be considered financial manipulation." My mom looked like she was about to cry. "Mike, we just want what's best for you. We'd never do anything to hurt you," she insisted. But it was over. I could see it in their faces. They knew they had lost. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the recordings I had collected over the past few weeks. Their voices filled the air, their intentions clear. Jack's face turned pale and my mom's hands started to shake. "We were hoping you could sign over your inheritance," Jack's voice said from the recording. "We're in a bind." Jack made a move like he was going to grab my phone, but Mr. Collins calmly blocked him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said evenly. "Everything is being recorded." My mom broke down then. She started crying, saying she was sorry, that she never meant for it to go this far. But I just stared at her, feeling empty. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You were planning this all along," I said, my voice steady. "I trusted you and you tried to use me." Jack, on the other hand, wasn't emotional. He leaned back in his chair, his face cold. "Fine, you got us, but don't act like you're some innocent kid. You've been living off your dad's money for years. We were just trying to get our share." His words hit me like a punch, but they also made everything crystal clear. This wasn't about family. It was all about greed. "Get out," I said, pointing to the door. "Both of you." "I'm done." They left, my mom still crying, and Jack muttering under his breath. When they were gone, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Lisa's dad put a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Mike," he said. Lisa, who had been waiting outside, came in and hugged me. "I'm proud of you." "You stood up for yourself," I nodded, but the truth was, I felt broken. I had wanted a family, and now I had none. But as I looked at Lisa and her dad, I realized I still had people who cared about me, people who had my back. Maybe it wasn't the happy ending I'd hoped for, but at least it was real. And sometimes that's all you can ask for.